The first time I saw her marching toward my driveway, I was halfway under my '72 Ford F-100, tightening a new exhaust bracket. She had that look, clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, as if she was just itching to call someone. Probably the police, or worse, the HOA board. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice already raised like I was a misbehaving teenager. "That vehicle has been parked in the same spot for over 48 hours. It is considered abandoned by HOA standards." I slid out from under the truck, wiping my hands on a rag. "It's my driveway, Fern McConnell, vice president of our HOA and full-time neighborhood menace." She was the type to measure grass height with a ruler and once find a guy for hanging his Christmas lights on November 1st. "It doesn't matter," she snapped. "Your vehicle," she said like it was a disease, "is an eyesore. It's rusting, it's taking up space, and it violates Article 6, Section 11 of the HOA Code." I stood up, towering over her 5-foot-nothing frame. "It's a restored classic. It's a junk heap," she said. "And unless it's moved by tomorrow, I'll have it towed." She turned on her heel and stormed off down the sidewalk like she just declared war. I stood there for a second, blinking at the audacity. "My name's Reid Thompson. I'm 42, been in this neighborhood for 7 years, and I own Thunderbolt Recovery and Tow just outside city limits. So yeah, I own the damn tow company." I almost laughed. Almost. The next morning, I woke up early on purpose, made coffee, sat on the porch with my dog Diesel, and waited. Right around 9, a flatbed turned the corner and rolled up in front of my house. Not one of mine, but a third party we occasionally subcontract. The driver hopped out, looking uncomfortable. "Hey, Mr. Thompson, this is awkward." "Don't worry, man," I said, walking down the porch steps. "Let me guess. Fern called in a tow on my truck," he nodded. "She said it was a hazard and she had board approval." Of course she did. That was a lie. I knew the HOA president, Greg, and he hated Fern more than I did. I walked around to the back of the truck, popped open the tailgate, and pulled out a bright red folder. Inside, proof of ownership, current registration, photos of the restoration process, and most importantly a letter from the city zoning board stating my truck was not in violation of any local ordinances. HOA be damned. "Do me a favor," I said to the driver, handing him the folder. "Call the number on the last page before you make any moves." He flipped through it, eyes widening. "Wait, this is your company, you got it." Just then, Fern came marching down the street again, heels clacking on the pavement like she was walking a runway. "What are you waiting for?" she shrieked. "Tow it." The driver looked between us, clearly wishing he were somewhere else. "Ma'am, I can't. This truck is legally parked, registered, and not in violation of any local or state codes." "I called you," she yelled, jabbing her finger at him. "You work for me. That vehicle is a blight on this community." "No, ma'am," he said, stepping back. "Actually, I work for him." Her face twisted. "What?" "I own Thunderbolt," I said, finally letting the grin break through. "You just tried to tow the truck of the guy who owns the company you called." She blinked, speechless for once. I leaned on the truck's hood. "And since you filed a fraudulent request and impersonated HOA authority without the president's approval. I think we've got a bigger problem now." Fern's jaw worked like she was chewing rocks, eyes darting from me to the driver and back again. Her hands clenched at her sides, knuckles white, but she didn't say a word. Not yet. That silence lasted all of 3 seconds. "You can't do this," she hissed finally. "This is obstruction. You're interfering with HOA enforcement." "You're not law enforcement," I said flatly. "And neither is the HOA. You don't get to fabricate violations and impersonate board authority. That's not enforcement, that's fraud." The tow driver handed the red folder back to me, clearly relieved to be out of it. "I'm heading out. Good luck, Mr. Thompson." He didn't wait around for Fern to come up with more nonsense. Fern's face reddened. "You think this little stunt's going to stop me? I have the authority to issue citations and enforce compliance. You haven't heard the last of this." "As a matter of fact," I said, pulling out my phone, "I think I have." I tapped the screen and held it up so she could hear. The recording played loud and clear her voice, from the day before, claiming she had full board approval to remove my truck. The problem was, the president hadn't even been in the state that week. He was at a municipal conference in Denver, and I'd spoken to him directly the night before. "You recorded me," she gasped. "You're standing on my property threatening illegal action. I have every right to record that." She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off. "Here's the part you might want to listen to closely." I skipped ahead to her saying she'd already filed the paperwork with the city to have the vehicle declared derelict. "You forged municipal paperwork," I said, voice low, "and submitted it under the HOA's name." That stopped her cold. She blinked, lips parting slightly, but no sound came out. "City clerk's office called me this morning," I continued. "Wanted to confirm the VIN and registration before processing your request." I explained the situation. "They're reviewing the documents you submitted. And according to them, the signature you provided doesn't match the HOA president's on record." Fern took one step back. "You don't understand." "No, I understand perfectly. You tried to get my truck seized with a fake report. That's forgery, Fern. That's a felony." She turned on her heel and stormed back toward her house, this time without the usual dramatic flair. No clipboard, no threats, just retreat. I didn't bother watching her go. I had a call to make. By late afternoon, Officer Delgado from the city's Property Crimes Division showed up at my house. He'd been briefed and asked to take a statement. I handed over the folder and the recording. He took them without hesitation and flipped through the contents, nodding slowly. "We've had a few complaints about this particular HOA," he said. "Mostly overreach stuff, petty fines, but this is something else." "She's been acting like she runs the place," I said. "The president hasn't endorsed half the things she does." "She's using the HOA name like it's a badge." Delgado snapped the folder shut. "Forgery under municipal pretenses is a serious charge. Depending on how she submitted the documents, she could be looking at mail fraud, too." "Wouldn't surprise me," I said. "She drops letters off personally, but she's been known to send out fake citations through certified mail. Some neighbors got violation notices with no record at the HOA office." He raised an eyebrow. "Any of them willing to talk?" I gestured toward the sidewalk. "You'll want to start with the Nelsons 2 doors down. She tried to fine them for having a wheelchair ramp installed." Delgado nodded once. "We'll follow up." By the time he left, word had already started to spread. The Nelsons walked over with their teenage grandson, who looked ecstatic just to see Fern finally getting called out. Then came Mr. Patel, a retired contractor who'd been fined for the color of his fence, despite it matching the HOA guidelines to the letter. They all had stories. And most of them had kept quiet out of fear of retaliation. "She threatened to revoke our clubhouse privileges," Mr. Patel said, shaking his head. "Said we'd be banned from voting if we didn't stay in compliance. But when I asked for the actual bylaw, she said it was a new policy in review. She told me my husband's memorial garden was too large," Mrs. Nelson added. "Said it was a landscape obstruction. I had to dig up half of it just to stop the fines." I offered them coffee and invited them to sit with me on the porch. Diesel lay at my feet, tail thumping as more neighbors gathered. Nobody was smiling. This wasn't gossip, it was collective outrage. "Tomorrow," I said, "we're calling a special meeting." Greg, the HOA president, called me that evening once he heard the news. He was still out of state but furious. "She forged my signature?" he asked, voice tight. "She claimed full board approval too." "The tow company she called confirmed she used your name on the service request." "She's done," he said. "I'll initiate an emergency board vote the second I'm back. Until then, document everything. I've got recordings, statements, and copies of every document she's ever mailed me." "Good. I'll have legal review it. If she used our letterhead on fraudulent documents, we're talking civil liability too. She's opened the HOA up to lawsuits." The next morning, I printed flyers and walked them door to door with a few volunteers. We scheduled the emergency meeting for Sunday evening at the community hall. The turnout was bigger than I expected. Nearly every household sent someone. Greg even joined via video call projected on the old pull-down screen at the front of the room. Fern arrived 20 minutes late and tried to sit at the board's table like nothing had happened, but Greg's voice came through the speakers before she could pull out a chair. "You no longer have board privileges," he said. "You're here as a resident only. Please sit with the others." She froze, stunned, then made her way to a seat in the back. Her usual air of superiority was gone. She looked like she'd aged 5 years overnight. Greg didn't waste time. He laid out the charges: unauthorized enforcement actions, misuse of HOA letterhead, forged signatures, fraudulent citations, and submission of illegal documents to the city. As he spoke, I handed out packets containing evidence copies of the forged documents, sworn statements from residents, and the city clerk's verification that the paperwork was not legitimate. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Fern kept her head down. Greg called for a vote to suspend her indefinitely pending legal review. It passed unanimously. Then he called for her permanent removal from the board. Another unanimous vote. No one spoke in her defense. After the meeting, Officer Delgado showed up again with a partner. Quietly, without making a scene, they asked Fern to step outside. She refused at first. Then someone whispered that she was being arrested. Half the room followed them out to the sidewalk, watching as she was placed in the back of the cruiser. No one cheered. No one jeered. We just watched. The silence said everything. The next week, the HOA board sent out a formal apology to every resident, along with instructions on how to appeal past fines. Greg promised full transparency moving forward. He also appointed a compliance review panel made up of residents, not just board members. As for me, I kept working on the truck. I added new chrome trim and replaced the bench seat upholstery. Diesel sat in the passenger side like it was his throne. Every now and then, someone walked by just to admire the truck. They'd stop, nod, and say, "Glad you stood up to her." I didn't say much in return, didn't need to. The driveway was quiet again, the way it should be, and Fern's house. For sale sign out front, no takers yet. The week after Fern's removal, things didn't quiet down, they shifted. The neighborhood felt like a shaken bottle of soda, fizzing just under the surface. People were friendlier, sure, but they were also nervous. The truth was out, but the consequences hadn't fully landed yet. Then, on Thursday morning, 2 unmarked cars rolled into the neighborhood and parked across from Greg's house. I was outside working on the tailgate hinge, and I recognized the posture of the men who stepped out, plainclothes investigators. Not from the local department, these guys had state credentials clipped to their belts. The kind that didn't knock twice. I stayed where I was, watching as they walked up to Greg's front door. He answered in a flannel shirt and jeans, still holding a coffee mug, and from the look on his face, this wasn't a surprise. After a short exchange, they stepped inside and the door shut behind them. About 20 minutes later, Greg called me. "They're asking for every paper trail Fern's ever left," he said, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it. "Not just the forged stuff, they want financials, vendor contracts, all of it." I wiped grease from my hands. "What are they looking for?" He hesitated. "They think she was embezzling." That word landed like a dropped wrench. I leaned against the truck bed, processing. It explained a lot: the high-volume fines, the sudden rule changes, the aggressive citations. It all made sense if she was funneling money somewhere. Greg continued. "They've already subpoenaed the HOA's bank records. We're missing over $37,000 from the last 18 months. I didn't ask how that slipped through. I knew most HOA boards ran on trust and volunteers, but Fern, she'd run on control. And she'd played that control like a shell game. I told them about the clubhouse renovation fund," Greg added. "She insisted on handling the contractor selection herself. None of the other board members ever saw an invoice." "Let me guess," I said. "The work never happened. Not a single receipt." That evening, I stopped by the Nelsons' place to check in. Their grandson, Marcus, answered the door and waved me in without a word. Inside, the dining table was covered in HOA mail yellow slips, typed warnings, and a handful of return checks. Mr. Nelson was sorting them into piles. "She fined us for unauthorized lawn furniture 3 times, he said, sliding a stack toward me. "We paid 2, both checks were cashed, but when I called the HOA office, they said there's no record." He handed me the bank statements. The checks were deposited into an account labeled Northridge Compliance Fund. I'd never heard of it. I nodded. "Mind if I take copies of these?" "Take them all," he said, pushing the whole pile toward me. "We want this buried." The next day, I met Greg and the investigators at the community hall. We used the back office, the one with the dusty file cabinets and a printer that hadn't worked since the pandemic. I laid out the Nelsons' paperwork, and one of the agents, a tall guy with a buzz cut, scanned each page with a portable scanner. "You seen this account before?" he asked Greg. "No," Greg admitted. "We only have 2, the operating account and the reserve fund." Buzz Cut glanced at his partner, who tapped something into a tablet. "She was laundering HOA fines through a separate bank account. That's felony wire fraud." He turned to me. "Did she ever mention a private fund or discretionary budget?" "She told neighbors their fines went toward compliance infrastructure," I said. "Whatever that means." Greg's eyebrows went up. "That's complete fiction." "There's no such line item." The agent nodded slowly, like he'd expected as much. "We've already frozen her personal accounts, but if she funneled HOA money through a shell LLC, we'll need to trace every payment." Greg rubbed his temples. "How long will that take?" "We've got a forensic audit team starting Monday." "But based on what we've seen, she was using HOA authority to pad a private slush fund." "We're talking mail fraud, wire fraud, and possibly identity theft if she signed anyone else's name." I looked at the table, suddenly remembering something. "She used my name once," I said, "to request a lien notice against the Patels, said I approved the fine as a contractor." Greg looked stunned. "You never told me that." "I didn't know until the Patels showed me. I thought it was a mistake." The agent leaned forward. "Do you still have that notice? I'll get it." I drove home, pulled out my own red folder now twice as thick, and found the copy. Sure enough, there it was. My name typed under the approval section, followed by a squiggled signature that looked nothing like mine. I brought it back within the hour. The agent photographed it, then turned to Greg. "She forged a contractor's endorsement to support a lien." "That's impersonation and falsifying legal records. She's looking at serious time." Greg was pale. "Do we notify the residents?" "Not yet," the agent said. "We'll coordinate with your legal counsel, but you should prepare them. This won't be a slap on the wrist." Over the weekend, the HOA's emergency legal team sent a letter to every household. It was brief, just enough to acknowledge an ongoing investigation and assure residents that their dues were being redirected through a verified escrow account. But it was enough to set the neighborhood buzzing. At the hardware store Monday morning, 2 different people stopped me in the paint aisle to ask what else had come out. I didn't say much, just that the investigation was expanding. But by Tuesday, more residents came forward. The Martinez family had their backyard playset removed by a hired crew Fern sent out. The invoice came from a company in her maiden name. The Hendricks had been double billed for their annual dues, both checks deposited into separate bank accounts. A pattern was forming. The agents set up a temporary office in the old HOA storage room. They brought in boxes of seized documents, computer backups, and a printer that actually worked. Residents trickled in each day, bringing files, emails, and returned checks. A manila envelope from the Rosens revealed something bigger. A grant application Fern had submitted to the State Housing Board using falsified compliance data. She'd inflated community improvement stats to qualify for a matching grant, then redirected the funds to a contractor who never did the work. That crossed a whole new line: federal fraud. By the end of the second week, a grand jury had been convened. The assistant district attorney held a closed-door meeting with Greg, the investigator team, and a few of us who'd provided early evidence. They laid it out clearly. Fern was facing a minimum of 5 felony counts, with more pending based on financial tracing. The HOA, though technically a victim, might also face penalties for failing to implement oversight. Greg asked the obvious question. How do we fix this? The ADA didn't sugarcoat. You rebuild. You hold a full board election, you implement third-party audits, and you make sure every resident gets a full report of what happened. Greg nodded. We will. The night before the grand jury announced its findings, I sat on my porch again, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. Diesel lay beside me, ears twitching at the passing breeze. A few neighbors passed by, all of them giving a wave or a nod. Then Marcus from the Nelson house rode up on his bike and stopped by the gate. You think she'll go to prison? He asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. I looked out across the neighborhood, the same one that had once felt like a minefield of rules and warnings. If she doesn't, I said, it won't be because we didn't try. He nodded, then pedaled off. The next morning, the indictment was public. 17 charges. Fraud, forgery, mail tampering, identity theft, and illegal misappropriation of community funds. A state-level case with federal implications. The HOA board met that evening in a packed community hall. Greg announced a full audit of all past citations, a refund process for illegitimate fines, and a new set of bylaws drafted with resident input. They also voted to bring in a third-party compliance officer, rotating annually. No one applauded. It wasn't that kind of meeting, but people stayed afterward talking, sharing, rebuilding. As I walked home, someone called out from their porch. Hey, Reid, that truck of yours, I turned. It's the best damn thing we've seen on this block in years. I gave a nod and kept walking. The truck sat in the driveway, gleaming under the streetlight, not just a machine anymore. It was a line in the sand. And this time we weren't letting anyone cross it without a fight. The morning after the indictment, things moved fast. A locksmith changed the locks on the HOA office, and a city-appointed forensic auditor arrived with 2 assistants to begin cataloging everything inside. The board had turned over keys, but the real surprise came when the auditor forced open the bottom drawer of a locked filing cabinet and found a stash of sealed envelopes labeled with individual resident names. Inside each envelope was a file, some fat, some thin, with what looked like personal information. Photos of backyards, annotated maps, even copies of private emails. They weren't HOA forms or citations. These were surveillance files. The auditor called the state attorney's office immediately, and within the hour, the evidence techs returned with new warrants. Greg rang my doorbell near noon, pale and tight-lipped, holding a folded sheet of paper. He didn't speak until we were in my garage with the door shut. They found a file on you, he said. And not just you, the Patels, the Martinez family, anyone who ever challenged her. He handed me the paper. It was a typed list with my name second from the top. Next to it, in red pen, someone had written, Track license renewals / pull property tax history. I stared at it, the air thick with something darker than anger now. This wasn't just a power trip, it was obsession. She was collecting personal data, I said. Illegally, Greg confirmed. No one authorized this. The auditor thinks she used public record sites and some paid background check service. I folded the paper and set it on my workbench. Why? Greg hesitated. They think she was using it to pressure people into compliance, quiet threats. Things like, shame if your mortgage company found out you're operating a business from home, that kind of thing. She ever threaten you? I asked. He gave a tired laugh. She once told me my wife's teaching credentials could come under review if I didn't support her new fine schedule. I stared at him. She wasn't bluffing, he said. She had our address history, employment records, stuff you can't just Google. We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of it settling in. This was no longer about enforcing rules. This was targeted coercion. That night, the local news ran a segment on the investigation. A reporter stood in front of our neighborhood sign with a live feed behind her showing police taking box loads of evidence from the HOA office. Residents started coming forward publicly. One woman admitted Fern had once left an anonymous typed letter in her mailbox warning her that non-compliance might affect her husband's security clearance. Another man confessed he'd installed blackout curtains after receiving a note that certain activities were visible from the street and might raise concerns. Each story painted a clearer picture. Fern hadn't just abused power, she'd used fear as a weapon. The state attorney general held a press conference the following morning. Behind the podium, he laid out a new set of charges: unlawful surveillance, misuse of public records, and coercion under color of authority. The last one hit hard. It meant she'd used the illusion of legal power to force compliance, a direct violation of state law. Fern was transferred from county to the state detention center by noon. And just like that, the neighborhood changed again. At the next board meeting, held outdoors under string lights and folding chairs, Greg stood up and didn't bother with a gavel or formalities. "No more closed doors," he said. "No more secret votes. From now on, we do everything in front of you." He stepped aside, and a woman named Alejandra, a retired systems analyst who'd lived here longer than anyone, took the mic. She held up a slim binder. "These are the new draft bylaws," she said. "No fines without photographic proof, no enforcement without a vote, and no surveillance of any kind without resident consent." The crowd applauded, not out of habit, but because it felt earned. They passed the reforms unanimously. Then they voted to dissolve the compliance subcommittee entirely. From now on, disputes would be mediated by a rotating panel of homeowners. No one person would hold that much unchecked power again. After the meeting, I walked back with Greg and Alejandra. "You think she was working alone?" I asked. Alejandra shook her head. "We might never know." But no one else had access to the surveillance files. The auditor's team found login data. It was all under her credentials. Greg added, "The vendor contracts were all tied to a P.O. box in her name. She forged the co-signatures." I stopped at my driveway and looked at them. "I'm not the forgiving type," I said. "But I don't want this place stuck in her shadow." Alejandra nodded. "Then we rebuild it the right way." Over the next 3 weeks, the neighborhood transformed. People started waving again. Lawn chairs came out. Kids played in front yards without parents peeking through the blinds. Greg and Alejandra oversaw the reimbursement process with the bank. Every improperly collected fine was refunded, and the reserve fund was replenished through a grant from the city's neighborhood recovery program. The clubhouse got its long overdue repairs, this time with real contractors and real invoices. Residents voted to name the rec room after Mrs. Nelson's late husband, whose garden had once been labeled a landscape obstruction. As for me, I kept working on the truck. I replaced the carburetor, polished the fenders, and finally got the original radio working again. Diesel had claimed the passenger seat as his permanent post. One afternoon, Marcus rolled up on his bike again, this time with a camera around his neck. "Taking pictures for the yearbook," he said. "Can I get one of the truck?" I nodded and stepped aside. He snapped a few, then paused. "You think someone like her could do it again?" "Not if people pay attention," I said. "Power only works if no one questions it." He nodded, thoughtful, then pointed toward the rec center. "They're planting a new tree out front, one for every person she threatened." I watched as residents gathered around a sapling, each tying a ribbon to its branches. "We'll run out of space," I said. "Then we'll plant more." He smiled and pedaled off. That night, I sat on the porch with Diesel again, the truck gleaming in the driveway. The wind was soft, the kind that carries echoes. Somewhere down the block, someone strummed a guitar. A few doors down, someone else set up a grill. The street had never been quieter or freer. And this time, there were no clipboards, no threats, just neighbors finally being neighbors again.